Factsverse presents. Teen thinks he's giving friend a ride, has no idea there is a secret plan to kill him. Before we get into this horrifying video, help us spread the word about Factsverse by clicking that like button. Also, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our future videos. Most people trust their friends. If you've been a friend to someone for, say, 10 years, you trust that they're never going to do anything serious to harm you, right? Well, that's what 17-year-old Ross Capicchioni believed. He met a friend when they were just 7 years old, and they remained friends for years. But they grew apart when they fell into different social circles. His friend got involved with gang members, and Ross became friends with kids who were not gang members. Even though their social circles took them down different paths, the two still remained friends. Or so Ross thought. The east side of Detroit is known as 7 Mile. This is a side of town you do not want to go to unless you absolutely must. The area is like a third-world country. It is very dangerous. On this side of town, the police won't even stop and get out of the car. They won't even pull cars over in this part because in most cases the people are gang members and are carrying guns. Ross's friend of 10 years asked him to take a ride with him to his cousin's house on the east side of Detroit. Ross always avoided that side of town, knowing it was dangerous. But because the boy was his friend for many years, he assumed that he'd be safe while there. The two got into Ross's Jeep Commander and headed to the dangerous section of the city. During the ride to the east side, Ross had an uneasy feeling. He knew he was in a dangerous situation, but he figured that since it was his friend, nothing bad would happen to him. He couldn't have been more wrong. It was a gang initiation, and Ross's friend chose him to be his victim. When Ross's friend told him that they'd arrived at their destination, Ross pulled over and got out of his Jeep. When he did, his friend shot him in the arm. Ross looked down in shock and asked his friend why he shot him. Rather than answering, his friend shot him again. This time it was in the chest. He fell to the ground and felt the barrel of a gun at his head. He quickly hit the gun away, but since it was a shotgun, it sprayed. He'd been shot 3 times by his friend. Surprisingly, he was still conscious when he saw his friend get into his Jeep and drive away. Ross knew he was good as dead if he didn't get up and try and save himself. It took all he had in him to get up and walk and find someone to help him. Since the police rarely patrolled the area, he'd need to find someone else to call for help. Fortunately, he did come across a probation officer. The man put his hand on Ross's back and gently laid him on the ground and called 911. He tried to get Ross to stay awake. He knew that if the boy were to fall unconscious, he might never wake up. While they waited for the ambulance to arrive, Ross kept starting to lose consciousness. He remembered hearing a third voice telling him to stay awake. As hard as he tried, he was too severely injured to stay conscious. When Ross arrived at the hospital, he was pronounced dead. But Ross says he couldn't have been dead because he remembers a doctor saying, "No, I'm going to try to save him." The first wound that the doctor needed to treat was the chest wound. It was the most serious injury, and without surgery, Ross would have died. Fortunately, the surgery was a success, and he was stable. When Ross was strong enough, his medical team worked on his head and arm injuries. They worked hard to save the boy's life. When Ross woke up after his surgery, he immediately panicked when he saw the machine on the side of him that was breathing for him. When the nurse saw that his eyes were open, she yelled, "He's awake! He's awake!" When the doctors came into the room, they asked him questions. He didn't know his name. He didn't know the president's name. He did, however, remember his father's phone number. It was great that Ross remembered his dad's phone number because it had been 3 days since he had been shot. This entire time his parents had no idea where he was. When they got the call, they rushed to their son's side in the hospital. When his mother walked into his room, he begged her not to be mad at him. She laughed and told him that she wasn't mad at all, she was just happy he survived. The FBI came in to talk to Ross about the shooter. They already know who did it. The shooter was bragging about what he had done to his friends and someone called to report him. With Ross's testimony, they were able to send him to jail. Because Ross survived, however, the shooter was not going to spend the rest of his life in prison. It was only attempted murder, not murder, so he was sentenced to 35 years. The first time he had to testify, Ross was in a wheelchair with staples still in his head. He had no teeth, a cast on his arm, and he was down to 105 pounds. When he went to court for the shooter's sentencing, he was able to walk into the courtroom and tell his story. It was a miracle that he survived. Have you ever had a long-time friend turn on you? Tell us your story in the comments below and subscribe for more.